The small town nestled by the river had always been a haven of peace and simplicity. Its residents, mostly close-knit families and elderly couples, cherished the quiet life it offered. The river, usually calm and sparkling under the sun, was the town's lifeline, providing a serene backdrop to its modest homes and lush green surroundings. On this particular weekend, the atmosphere was far from its usual tranquility. A storm was brewing, and the sky, dark and ominous, seemed to carry the weight of an approaching disaster. Barron Trump, visiting the town for a brief retreat, had chosen this place for its untouched beauty and its promise of peace away from the bustling world. He had a particular fondness for nature, finding solace in its stillness and simplicity. That evening, as he walked along the riverbank, he noticed the wind picking up and the trees swaying more violently with each gust. A foreboding tension lingered in the air. The townsfolk, usually welcoming and relaxed, were now hurried and anxious, preparing for what the weather reports had ominously described as the storm of the decade. As night fell, the first signs of chaos began to unfold. The river, once a gentle giant, started to swell with alarming speed. Its waters, now muddy and raging, began to creep closer to the houses lining its banks. Families, heeding the warnings, started packing their belongings, bundling up children and shepherding pets into cars. Rescue teams dressed in bright jackets arrived to help evacuate the most vulnerable. Flashlights and shouts cut through the torrential rain, a stark contrast to the town's usual stillness. Barron, observing the scene from his window, couldn't ignore the rising panic outside. His nature had always been one of quiet observation paired with an innate sense of empathy. Even as a teenager, he had a maturity that belied his years, a calm, composed demeanor coupled with a strong sense of compassion for others. This storm, he realized, was more than an event. It was a test of resilience for the people around him, and something about their plight stirred a deep resolve within him. From his vantage point, he could see the river swallowing the lower streets. The lights of rescue boats flickered against the stormy backdrop. The cries of frightened children and the desperate calls of families searching for missing pets filled the air. It was in these moments that the true magnitude of the storm hit him. Yet, amid the chaos, there was something quietly resolute about the townspeople. They fought together, unyielding against nature's wrath. Barron found himself deeply moved by their spirit, though he couldn't shake a growing feeling that there was more he could do than simply watch. As the storm's fury escalated, it became clear that this was not just a natural disaster, but a defining moment for everyone caught in its wake. Unbeknownst to Barron, his role in the unfolding events would become a story of courage, kindness, and the extraordinary strength of the human spirit. The storm's wrath showed no sign of letting up as the river continued its relentless rise, swallowing streets and creeping closer to the homes of those who hadn't yet managed to flee. Families clutched what belongings they could carry, their hurried footsteps splashing through ankle-deep water. Parents huddled children under rain-soaked jackets, and rescue workers shouted instructions over the roar of the storm. Amid this frenzy, Barron watched from a covered porch, his sharp eyes scanning the chaos. He could see the fear etched on people's faces, but one stood out from the rest, a frail, elderly woman whose cries pierced through the cacophony of the storm. Mrs. Thompson, a lifelong resident of the town, was standing knee-deep in the water, her hands cupped around her mouth as she shouted a single name over and over. "Buddy!" Her voice cracked with desperation, her eyes darting around wildly, searching for a small figure that wasn't there. Buddy, her beloved golden retriever, had been her constant companion since her husband's passing 2 years ago. To her, Buddy wasn't just a pet, he was family, a source of unconditional love and comfort in her solitude. Losing him to the merciless floodwaters was unthinkable. Barron stepped out onto the porch, the cold rain immediately soaking through his clothes. He could see Mrs. Thompson pacing along the edge of her flooded yard, her frail frame trembling not just from the chill but from sheer panic. A rescue worker approached her, trying to guide her toward higher ground, but she resisted, pointing toward the murky water. "I can't leave without him," she cried, her voice a mix of pleading and defiance. Watching her, Barron felt a pang of empathy so sharp it compelled him to act. The danger was evident. The rushing water carried debris, and the currents were strong enough to sweep away anyone who ventured too far. Yet he couldn't shake the image of Mrs. Thompson standing there, drenched and broken, clinging to hope as the storm threatened to tear it away. He glanced at the rescue worker, who shook his head, clearly unwilling to risk another life for a lost dog. Barron's decision was made in that instant. Ignoring the warnings shouted in his direction, Barron grabbed a flashlight and stepped off the porch into the rising water. The cold bit at his legs and the current tugged at his every step, but his resolve didn't waver. Mrs. Thompson saw him and reached out as if to stop him, her tear-streaked face filled with a mix of gratitude and fear. "You don't have to," she began, but Barron cut her off with a steady look and a calm reassurance. "I'll find him." The flashlight's beam cut through the gloom as Barron waded deeper into the flooded streets, his ears straining for any sound amidst the storm. The water swirled around his knees, rising with every passing moment, but he pressed on, driven by a single purpose: to bring Buddy back to the woman who needed him more than anything. The icy water rose steadily as Barron waded deeper into the flooded streets, the flashlight in his hand cutting weakly through the sheets of rain. The current tugged at his legs with every step, dragging debris past him: tree branches, bits of fencing, even a child's abandoned bicycle. Each surge of the water threatened to unsteady his footing, but Barron moved forward, his jaw set with determination. Around him, the eerie silence of the storm's destruction was punctuated by the distant hum of rescue boats and the muffled cries of people calling for loved ones. He ignored it all, his focus singular. He had to find Buddy. The further he ventured from the safety of the higher ground, the darker and more treacherous the waters became. A gutted car, its headlights still faintly flickering, blocked one path, forcing Barron to climb over its submerged hood. The movement sent a ripple through the water, and for a terrifying moment he thought he might slip into the deeper current swirling around the car. Catching himself, he paused to regain his balance, breathing heavily, the rain running in rivulets down his face. "Buddy!" he called out, his voice steady despite the roaring storm. The name echoed faintly, swallowed almost immediately by the howling wind. He strained his ears, listening for anything, any sound that might give him a clue. For a moment there was nothing but the relentless rush of the floodwaters. Then, faint and fragile, he heard it, a whimper. It was distant but unmistakable, a sound of fear and desperation that sent a surge of adrenaline through his veins. Barron turned toward the direction of the sound, his flashlight beam scanning the water's surface. "Buddy!" he called again, louder this time. The whimper came again, a little closer, a little more urgent. Barron pushed forward, his movements more hurried now, his heart pounding in his chest. The water climbed higher, soaking his waist, his breath hitching as the cold seeped into his core. Every step felt heavier, the current growing stronger, as though the river itself was trying to stop him. Finally, his flashlight caught a flash of movement, a small trembling shape clinging to a piece of debris. Barron squinted, focusing the beam. There he was, Buddy, a golden retriever, drenched and shivering, balanced precariously on a broken plank of wood, his eyes, wide with fear, locked onto Barron's as though sensing a lifeline. "Hang on, Buddy," Barron murmured, his voice steady despite the chaos around him. The sight spurred him onward, but the distance wasn't without peril. The water surged against him as he approached, debris brushing past his legs, threatening to throw him off balance. He reached out carefully, speaking softly to calm the terrified dog. Buddy whimpered, his paws scrabbling against the slick wood. With one swift motion, Barron closed the gap, scooping Buddy into his arms. The dog clung to him, trembling but alive. As Barron turned back toward safety, the weight of the rescue both literal and emotional in his arms. The weight of Buddy in Barron's arms was both comforting and daunting as he turned back toward safety. The dog's soaked fur clung to him and he could feel the animal trembling, its small body pressed tightly against his chest. "It's okay. I've got you," Barron murmured, his voice steady despite the chaos around him. Buddy let out a soft whimper, his eyes wide with fear but slowly softening as if he understood he was no longer alone. The journey back was treacherous. The current, already fierce on the way in, had grown stronger, pushing against Barron's every step. His footing was unstable on the submerged streets littered with debris. With each step, the water seemed to grow colder, biting through his clothes and numbing his legs. Barron's focus never wavered, though his breath came in short bursts, the strain of fighting against the flood and carrying Buddy taking its toll. At one point, his foot snagged on something unseen beneath the water, causing him to stumble. He fell to one knee, his heart lurching as the water surged around him, threatening to pull him under. Buddy yelped in alarm, scrambling to maintain his grip on Barron. Bracing himself, Barron tightened his hold on the dog and pushed back to his feet. The flashlight slipped from his hand and vanished into the murky depths, but he pressed on, guided now only by the faint glow of distant lights and the distant voices of rescue workers. As he neared the edge of the floodwaters, he could see a small crowd gathered, their silhouettes illuminated by the flickering beams of flashlights. Mrs. Thompson's voice rang out, rising above the storm's noise. Buddy, Buddy! The desperation in her tone struck a chord in Barron, fueling his determination to reach her. With a final surge of effort, Barron broke through the rushing water onto firmer ground. The rescue workers rushed forward to steady him, their hands firm on his arms as he staggered slightly under the weight of exhaustion. Buddy squirmed in his grasp, his tail wagging weakly as he caught sight of Mrs. Thompson. Barron bent down, setting the dog gently on the ground, and Buddy immediately bolted toward her. The reunion was immediate and deeply emotional. Mrs. Thompson dropped to her knees, wrapping her arms around Buddy as tears streamed down her face. "Oh, Buddy," she sobbed, burying her face in his damp fur. The dog barked softly, licking her face as if to reassure her he was safe. Those watching couldn't help but be moved by the scene, some clapping softly while others wiped away tears. Mrs. Thompson turned to Barron, her voice trembling. "I don't know how to thank you," she said, her gratitude pouring out in every word. Barron, still catching his breath, simply nodded, his face calm but touched with quiet relief. "I'm just glad he's okay," he said softly. The moment, raw and filled with humanity, stood as a testament to the power of compassion, even in the face of overwhelming odds. Mrs. Thompson held Buddy close, her frail hands trembling as she stroked his drenched fur. Tears flowed freely down her weathered cheeks, her sobs audible even over the roar of the storm. Those around her stood in quiet reverence, moved by the raw display of emotion. She looked up at Barron, her eyes shining with gratitude and a depth of feeling words could barely convey. You brought him back to me," she said, her voice breaking as she struggled to find the right words. "I thought I'd lost him forever." Barron, still catching his breath and dripping with rain, offered a small, almost bashful smile. "I'm just glad he's safe," he replied, his tone soft, unassuming. He wiped the rain from his face with his sleeve, his gaze fixed on Buddy's wagging tail and Mrs. Thompson's trembling hands. It was clear that to him, the act wasn't about heroics. It was about doing what needed to be done. Mrs. Thompson, however, couldn't let it rest at that. She gently placed Buddy on the ground, though the dog stayed pressed to her side, his tail swishing furiously. She stood unsteadily and took a step toward Barron, her hands reached out, resting on his soaked arms, as if grounding herself in the moment. "You don't understand what this means to me," she said, her voice stronger now, though still choked with emotion. "Buddy, he's not just my dog. He's my family. My husband gave him to me just before he passed." The words hung in the air, the weight of her story silencing everyone. Mrs. Thompson's voice wavered as she continued, her tears mixing with the rain. "We were married for 40 years. When his health started failing, he wanted to make sure I wouldn't be alone. So, he brought Buddy home one day, this tiny, wiggling bundle of fur." She smiled faintly at the memory, her fingers brushing Buddy's damp fur. "He told me Buddy would look after me when he couldn't anymore." Her gaze returned to Barron, her expression a mix of grief and gratitude. "Losing Buddy tonight would have been like losing my husband all over again. But you risked everything to bring him back to me." Her voice broke again, and she shook her head as though trying to comprehend his selflessness. "You didn't have to, but you did. I'll never forget this. Never." Barron shifted uncomfortably, unused to such heartfelt praise. "It was the right thing to do," he said simply, his humility genuine and unwavering. "Anyone would have done the same." Mrs. Thompson smiled through her tears, a look of deep understanding crossing her face. "Maybe," she said quietly, "but you were the one who did." She pulled him into a brief, unexpected embrace, her arms frail but full of gratitude. Those watching felt the profound significance of the moment, a testament to courage, kindness, and the unexpected ways lives intersect during times of need. Barron, as always, remained humble, quietly returning to the sidelines as Mrs. Thompson and Buddy shared their bittersweet reunion. The rain finally began to subside, leaving behind a quiet calm that felt almost surreal after the chaos of the storm. The town was bruised and battered, with muddy streets, toppled fences, and waterlogged homes bearing witness to the destruction. Yet, amidst the wreckage, a sense of unity and hope emerged, embodied by the story of Barron's selfless act. News of the young man who braved the floodwaters to rescue a dog spread quickly. It began with the small crowd that had witnessed the reunion of Mrs. Thompson and Buddy, their accounts filled with awe and emotion. By the next day, whispers turned into full-blown conversations, and soon, the story reached beyond the town's limits. Local reporters arrived to cover the aftermath of the storm, but it was Barron's quiet heroism that captured their attention. Photos of him, soaked and determined, carrying Buddy through the floodwater surfaced, and his actions quickly became the centerpiece of the town's story of resilience. Social media lit up as locals shared the tale, their posts accompanied by heartfelt captions praising Barron's courage and kindness. In a world so divided, it's stories like these that restore faith in humanity, one post read, garnering thousands of likes and shares. Animal lovers from around the country chimed in, moved by the lengths Barron went to save a life many might have deemed less significant. Advocacy groups dedicated to animal welfare reached out, expressing their admiration for his bravery and using his story to highlight the importance of treating all lives with compassion. Messages poured in from strangers, thanking Barron for reminding the world of the impact one person could make, no matter their circumstances. For Barron, the sudden attention was both unexpected and overwhelming. He had acted instinctively, driven by his belief in doing what was right. The flood of gratitude and recognition was never his goal, and he preferred to stay out of the spotlight, retreating to the edges of the town as the media frenzy grew. When asked for interviews, he politely declined, his modesty endearing him even further to those who heard about his actions. Mrs. Thompson, however, embraced the opportunity to share the story. Still deeply moved by what Barron had done, she spoke to anyone willing to listen about the importance of kindness and community. She spearheaded a local campaign to raise funds for families displaced by the storm, dedicating her efforts to Barron and Buddy. Her voice, filled with passion and gratitude, inspired others to join the cause, and donations poured in from far and wide. Back in town, a ripple effect began to take hold. Inspired by Barron's example, neighbors who had barely exchanged greetings before the storm now worked side by side to rebuild. Strangers offered to foster displaced pets, while others volunteered to repair damaged homes. It was as if Barron's bravery had unlocked something dormant in the town, a shared belief that even small acts of compassion could ripple outward, creating something far greater. Though Barron remained on the sidelines, the impact of his actions was unmistakable. As he walked quietly through the streets, watching the town come together, he couldn't help but feel a quiet pride, not for himself, but for the kindness he had helped ignite in others. In his heart, he knew that was the real legacy of the night he carried Buddy to safety. As the weeks passed, the town began to heal. The water receded, leaving behind a landscape scarred by the storm, but filled with the determination of its people. Barron watched quietly from the sidelines as the community came together, rebuilding homes, repairing streets, and caring for those who had lost the most. The town's spirit had shifted, as if the storm had uncovered a deeper strength and a shared understanding of the power of kindness. Stories of compassion during the storm circulated, but none resonated as deeply as the tale of Buddy's rescue. For Mrs. Thompson, life took on new meaning. Each day, she and Buddy walked through the recovering streets, a testament to resilience and the enduring bond between them. Buddy, no longer the frightened dog clinging to a piece of debris, now walked proudly by her side, tail wagging with newfound energy. The townspeople greeted them warmly, their smiles a reflection of the hope Buddy and Mrs. Thompson symbolized. The elderly woman often spoke of Barron, her voice filled with gratitude, as she recounted how his courage had saved not just Buddy, but her own spirit. One evening, as the sun set over the rebuilt town, Mrs. Thompson sat at her small wooden desk, a pen in her hand and a blank piece of paper before her. She had been thinking about Barron ever since the storm, wanting to express what she couldn't fully say in the aftermath. As she began to write, the words came easily, her emotions pouring onto the page. She thanked him for his bravery, for risking everything to save Buddy, and for showing her that kindness still thrived in the world. She shared how Buddy had been her lifeline after her husband's passing, and how Barron's actions had given her a renewed sense of purpose. When the letter was finished, she carefully folded it and handed it to a neighbor who promised to deliver it to Barron. Days later, Barron received the letter at his temporary home on the outskirts of town. He unfolded it slowly, his expression softening as he read Mrs. Thompson's heartfelt words. She had included a picture of herself and Buddy, taken shortly after the storm. In the photo, they stood in front of their repaired home, both looking healthier and happier. Buddy's tail was a blur of motion, his joy evident even in the still frame. Barron smiled, a quiet, genuine expression that lit up his usually composed face. He didn't seek recognition or praise, but the letter touched him deeply. It was a reminder of why he had acted that night, why he had ventured into the floodwaters despite the risks. It wasn't about heroism. It was about doing what was right and making a difference, no matter how small. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Barron folded the letter carefully and placed it in his bag, knowing he would keep it as a reminder of the night that had changed so many lives. The storm had brought destruction, but it had also revealed the enduring power of kindness, And in a world often shadowed by challenges, that power was enough to inspire hope, one act at a time. This story reminds us of the incredible impact one act of kindness can have, transforming lives and inspiring hope even in the darkest moments. Barron's bravery and compassion showed that courage is about stepping up when it matters most. What would you have done in his shoes? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If this story moved you, don't forget to give this video a thumbs up, share it with someone who needs a little hope today, and subscribe to our channel for more inspiring stories like this. Together, let's spread positivity and kindness.